The church was filled with the soft hum of anticipation. Guests sat in their best attire, their faces glowing with joy as they waited for the bride to walk down the aisle. The groom stood at the altar, his hands clenched tightly behind his back. His jaw was tight, and his eyes darted nervously across the room. Something about him seemed off, but no one dared to say a word. After all, it was his wedding day, nerves were expected. The music began to play, and all eyes turned to the back of the church. The bride appeared, radiant in her white gown, her smile lighting up the room. She walked slowly, her eyes locked on the man she was about to marry. The guests sighed in admiration, some even wiping away tears. It was a picture-perfect moment, the kind you'd see in a movie. But as she reached the altar, everything changed. The groom's face darkened. His hands, once clasped behind his back, dropped to his sides. Before anyone could react, he raised his hand and, slap. The sound echoed through the church, sharp and unmistakable. The bride stumbled back, her hand flying to her cheek, her eyes wide with shock. The guests gasped, some standing up in their seats, others covering their mouths in disbelief. The groom stood frozen, his chest heaving, his face a mix of anger and something else, regret, perhaps? The bride, tears streaming down her face, turned and ran out of the church, her veil trailing behind her. The groom didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the spot where she had been moments before. The room erupted into chaos. Guests whispered furiously to one another, some rushing after the bride, others glaring at the groom. The best man stepped forward, grabbing the groom by the arm and shaking him. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he hissed. But the groom didn't respond. He just stared straight ahead, as if in a trance. Outside, the bride collapsed into the arms of her best friend, who had followed her out. "I can't believe he did that," she sobbed. "I can't believe he humiliated me like this." Her friend held her tightly, whispering words of comfort, but the damage was done. The bride's heart was shattered, and the dream of her perfect wedding was gone. Back inside the church, the groom finally seemed to snap out of his daze. He looked around at the sea of angry and confused faces, his own expression one of utter despair. Without a word, he turned and walked out of the church, leaving behind a room full of unanswered questions. The guests slowly began to disperse, their excitement replaced by a heavy sense of unease. What had just happened? Why had the groom slapped his bride at the altar? And what would happen next? The story was far from over, but one thing was clear: this was a wedding no one would ever forget. 2 years earlier, the couple had met in the most ordinary of ways, at a coffee shop. She was standing in line, scrolling through her phone, when he accidentally bumped into her, spilling his coffee on her shoes. He apologized profusely, his face turning red with embarrassment. She laughed it off, saying it was just a pair of shoes. They started talking, and before they knew it, an hour had passed. There was an instant connection between them. She was warm, outgoing, and had a way of making everyone around her feel at ease. He was more reserved, thoughtful, and had a dry sense of humor that she found endearing. They exchanged numbers and started seeing each other regularly. Their relationship blossomed quickly. They spent weekends exploring the city, trying new restaurants, and sharing their dreams for the future. She loved how he listened to her, really listened, and he admired her strength and independence. They were different in many ways, but those differences seemed to complement each other. However, not everyone was happy about their relationship. The groom's family was traditional and had certain expectations about who he should marry. When he introduced her to them, the tension was palpable. His parents were polite but distant, and his siblings made subtle comments that made her feel unwelcome. She tried to brush it off, telling herself that they just needed time to get to know her. But the comments didn't stop. At family gatherings, she would overhear whispers about how she didn't fit in or how her background was too different. The groom defended her, but the constant criticism began to wear him down. He started to question whether he was doing the right thing by staying with her, even though he loved her deeply. Her family, on the other hand, saw the warning signs early on. Her mother warned her about the groom's temper, which she had noticed during a heated argument they had at a family dinner. "He's not the one for you," her mother said. "You deserve someone who will respect you, no matter what." But she was in love, and love, she believed, could overcome anything. As the months went by, the pressure from his family grew. They made it clear that they didn't approve of the relationship, and the groom found himself torn between the woman he loved and the family he had always looked up to. He started to withdraw, becoming more distant and irritable. She noticed the change, but didn't know how to address it. When he finally proposed, it was a bittersweet moment. She said yes, of course, but there was a part of her that wondered if they were making a mistake. Still, she pushed those doubts aside, determined to make their relationship work. The wedding planning brought even more stress. His family refused to help, and the groom became increasingly frustrated. He started to lash out at her over small things, and their arguments became more frequent. She tried to stay positive, telling herself that everything would be okay once they were married. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. The day of the wedding arrived, and the tension between them was thicker than ever. She tried to focus on the joy of the day, but his cold demeanor made it difficult. As she walked down the aisle, she hoped that seeing her in her wedding dress would remind him of why they were doing this. But it didn't. And now, as she sat in her best friend's car, still wearing her wedding dress, she couldn't help but wonder if her mother had been right all along. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a whirlwind of emotions. The bride threw herself into the preparations, determined to make the day perfect. She spent hours choosing the right flowers, the perfect dress, and the most beautiful venue. She wanted everything to be just right, not just for herself, but for him too. She hoped that if the day was flawless, it might ease the tension that had been growing between them. But the groom seemed distant, almost detached. He would nod along to her ideas, but his heart wasn't in it. She noticed how he would avoid talking about the wedding, changing the subject whenever she brought it up. At first, she thought it was just stress. Wedding planning was overwhelming, after all. But as the days went by, she began to wonder if there was something more going on. One evening, as they sat together in their small apartment, she finally confronted him. "You've been so quiet lately," she said, her voice gentle, but firm. "Is everything okay? Are you having second thoughts?" He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and frustration. "It's not you," he said after a long pause. "It's just, my family. They're making this so much harder than it needs to be." She reached out and took his hand, trying to reassure him. "We knew this wouldn't be easy," she said. "But we're in this together, right? We'll get through it." He nodded, but she could tell he wasn't convinced. The groom's family had made their disapproval clear from the start. They had never been shy about their opinions, and the closer the wedding got, the more vocal they became. His mother called him almost daily, urging him to reconsider. "She's not right for you," she would say. "Think about your future. Think about your family." His father was even harsher. "You're making a mistake," he said during one particularly heated conversation. "And don't expect us to support it." The groom tried to stand his ground, but the constant criticism was wearing him down. He began to doubt himself, wondering if his family was right. Maybe he was making a mistake. Maybe he wasn't strong enough to handle the challenges that came with their relationship. The bride, meanwhile, was doing her best to stay positive. She leaned on her friends and family for support, but even they could see the toll it was taking on her. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" her best friend asked one day. "You deserve someone who's all in, not someone who's being pulled in a million directions." The bride smiled, but her eyes were sad. "I love him," she said simply. "And I believe in us." But as the wedding day approached, even she began to feel the strain. The groom's mood swings became more frequent, and their arguments more intense. She tried to be patient, to give him the space he needed, but it was hard. She wanted to feel excited about their wedding, but instead, she felt anxious and uncertain. The night before the wedding, they sat together in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The bride wanted to talk, to reassure him that everything would be okay, but she didn't know what to say. The groom, meanwhile, was consumed by doubt. He kept replaying his family's words in his head, wondering if he was making the biggest mistake of his life. The morning of the wedding, the bride woke up early, her heart pounding with a mix of excitement and fear. She looked at herself in the mirror, taking in the sight of her wedding dress hanging on the door. This was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, but all she felt was a deep sense of unease. The groom, on the other hand, woke up feeling numb. He went through the motions of getting ready, his mind racing with thoughts of what was to come. As he stood at the altar, waiting for her to walk down the aisle, he felt a wave of panic wash over him. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't sure if he ever would be. And then she appeared, beautiful and radiant, and for a moment everything else faded away. But as she reached him, the weight of his doubts and fears became too much to bear. In a moment of weakness, he lashed out, and the sound of the slap echoed through the church, shattering the fragile illusion of their perfect day. The bride's best friend drove her away from the church, the sound of her sobs filling the car. She couldn't believe what had just happened. One moment, she had been walking down the aisle, filled with hope and excitement. The next, she was running out of the church, her cheek stinging and her heart broken. "I don't understand," she cried, her voice trembling. "How could he do that to me? In front of everyone?" Her friend gripped the steering wheel tightly, her own anger simmering just below the surface. "I don't know," she said through gritted teeth. "But he's going to regret it. I promise you that." Meanwhile, back at the church, the guests were in a state of shock. The groom's best man grabbed him by the arm and pulled him into a side room, slamming the door behind them. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he demanded, his voice low but furious. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" The groom sank into a chair, his head in his hands. "I don't know," he muttered. I panicked. I didn't mean to hurt her." "Well, you did," his best man shot back. "And now you've got to fix it. You can't just let her walk away like that." The groom looked up, his eyes filled with regret. "I don't know if she'll ever forgive me," he said quietly. "You'd better hope she does," his best man replied. "Because if you don't fix this, you're going to lose her forever." The groom knew he was right. He had made a terrible mistake, and now he had to face the consequences. But the thought of confronting her, of seeing the pain he had caused, filled him with dread. Back at her friend's apartment, the bride sat on the couch, still in her wedding dress, staring blankly at the wall. Her friend handed her a cup of tea, but she barely noticed. Her mind was racing, replaying the moment over and over again. "What are you going to do?" her friend asked gently. The bride shook her head. "I don't know," she whispered. I can't believe this is happening." Her friend sat down beside her, putting an arm around her shoulders. "You don't have to figure it all out right now," she said. "Just take it one step at a time." The bride nodded, but her mind was already made up. She couldn't just let this go. She needed answers. She needed to know why he had done what he did. The next morning, she called him. Her hands were shaking as she dialed his number, but she knew she had to do this. She had to face him. He answered on the first ring. "I'm so sorry," he said immediately, his voice choked with emotion. "I don't know what came over me. I never meant to hurt you." She took a deep breath, trying to steady her voice. "We need to talk," she said. "In person." He agreed without hesitation. They arranged to meet at the church later that day, the same place where everything had fallen apart. When she arrived, he was already there, waiting for her. He looked terrible, his eyes bloodshot, his face pale. He stood up as she approached, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Don't," she said firmly. "Just, don't." He nodded, sitting back down. She sat across from him, her arms crossed, her expression guarded. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you do it?" He looked down at his hands, unable to meet her gaze. I was scared, he admitted. I let my family get into my head, and I started to doubt everything. I thought I was making a mistake. She stared at him, her heart breaking all over again. So you thought hitting me was the answer? No, he said quickly. Of course not. I wasn't thinking. I panicked. And I'm so sorry. She looked at him, searching his face for any sign that he was being sincere. And she saw it, the regret, the pain, the love that was still there, buried beneath all the hurt. I don't know if I can forgive you, she said honestly. But I need time to think. He nodded, tears streaming down his face. I understand, he said. And whatever you decide, I'll respect it. She stood up, her heart heavy, but her mind clear. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure, she deserved better than this. The days that followed were a blur for the bride. She moved in with her best friend temporarily, needing space to think and heal. Her wedding dress hung in the closet, a painful reminder of what could have been. She avoided looking at it, but its presence was impossible to ignore. Every time she opened the closet, it was there, staring back at her like a ghost of the life she had almost had. Her friends and family rallied around her, offering support and advice. Some urged her to walk away for good, while others encouraged her to give him another chance. People make mistakes, her mother said gently one evening. But it's up to you to decide if this is something you can move past. The bride appreciated their concern, but she knew this was a decision she had to make on her own. She spent hours replaying their relationship in her mind, trying to make sense of what had happened. She thought about the good times, the laughter, the love, the way he had made her feel like she was the most important person in the world. But she also thought about the bad times, the arguments, the tension, the way he had let his family's opinions come between them. And then there was the slap. It wasn't just the physical act that hurt, it was the betrayal. He had humiliated her in front of everyone they cared about, and that was something she wasn't sure she could forgive. One evening, as she sat alone in her friend's living room, she made a decision. She needed to see him one more time. Not to reconcile, but to get closure. She needed to hear his side of the story, to understand why he had done what he did. And then, maybe, she could finally move on. She called him and arranged to meet at a quiet park, near their old apartment. It was a neutral space, somewhere they could talk without the weight of their past hanging over them. When she arrived, he was already there, sitting on a bench, staring at the ground. He looked up as she approached, his eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. She nodded, sitting down beside him but keeping a careful distance between them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind. Finally, she broke the silence. "I need to know why," she said. "Not just why you did it, but why you let things get to that point. Why you let your family's opinions matter more than us." He took a deep breath, his hands trembling as he clasped them together. "I was weak," he admitted. "I let their words get to me, and I started to doubt everything. I thought I wasn't strong enough to handle the challenges that came with our relationship. And when I saw you walking down the aisle, looking so perfect, so sure of everything, I panicked. I felt like I didn't deserve you, like I was going to ruin everything." She listened quietly, her heart aching at his words. "But instead of talking to me, you hit me," she said, her voice breaking. "You chose to hurt me, instead of trusting me." "I know," he said, tears streaming down his face. "And I'll regret it for the rest of my life. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know that I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." She looked at him, her own tears falling now. "I loved you," she said. "I loved you so much. But I can't be with someone who doesn't trust me, who doesn't believe in us enough to fight for us." He nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I understand," he said. "And I'll respect your decision, whatever it is." She stood up, wiping her tears away. "I need time," she said. Time to heal, to figure out what I want. And I need you to give me that space. He nodded again, his face filled with sorrow. I'll do whatever you need, he said. She turned and walked away, her heart heavy, but her mind clear. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of peace. She had made her decision, and now it was time to start rebuilding her life. After their conversation in the park, the groom was left with a heavy heart. He had lost the woman he loved, and he had no one to blame but himself. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, and he knew he couldn't just sit back and let his life fall apart. He had to do something, not just to win her back, but to become the man she deserved. The first step was seeking help. He reached out to a therapist, someone who could help him unpack the anger and insecurity that had led to that moment at the altar. It wasn't easy. Sitting in that small office, talking about his deepest fears and regrets, felt like peeling back layers of himself he had long buried. But he stuck with it, week after week, determined to understand why he had let his family's opinions and his own doubts control him. The therapist helped him see that his actions weren't just about the wedding or his family's disapproval. They were rooted in a deeper fear of failure, of not being enough. You have to learn to separate your worth from other people's expectations, the therapist told him. Until you do, you'll keep repeating the same patterns. It was a hard truth to swallow, but he knew it was right. He started to confront his family, setting boundaries for the first time in his life. He told them that while he loved them, he couldn't let their opinions dictate his choices anymore. It wasn't easy, there were arguments, tears, and even threats of cutting ties, but he stood his ground. For the first time, he felt like he was taking control of his life. Meanwhile, he also reached out to the people he had hurt. He apologized to the guests who had witnessed the slap, acknowledging how his actions had tarnished what should have been a joyful occasion. He even reached out to the bride's family, though he knew they might never forgive him. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, he told her mother over the phone. I just want you to know that I'm sorry, and I'm working to be better. Her mother was silent for a long moment before responding. I hope you mean that, she said. Because she deserves someone who will love and respect her, no matter what. I know, he said. And I'm trying to be that person. But the hardest part was staying away from the bride. He wanted to call her, to tell her about the changes he was making, to beg for another chance. But he knew she needed space, and he respected that. Instead, he focused on himself, on becoming the kind of man she could be proud of. Months passed, and slowly, he began to feel like a different person. He was calmer, more self-aware, and more confident in his decisions. He still had moments of doubt, but he was learning to handle them without lashing out. One day, he decided to write her a letter. Not to ask for forgiveness or to plead for another chance, but simply to let her know how sorry he was and how much she had meant to him. He poured his heart into the words, telling her about the work he had been doing and the lessons he had learned. I don't expect anything from you, he wrote. But I needed you to know that I'm sorry, and that I'll always be grateful for the love we shared. You made me a better person, and I'll carry that with me for the rest of my life. He mailed the letter and tried to let it go. He didn't know if she would read it, or if she would even care. But for him, it was a way of closing a chapter, of acknowledging the pain he had caused and the growth that had come from it. Little did he know, the bride had been following his journey from afar. She had heard about his therapy, his efforts to make amends, and the changes he was making in his life. And though she wasn't ready to forgive him, she couldn't deny that he was trying. For the bride, the months following the wedding were a journey of self-discovery and healing. She had always been a strong, independent woman, but the betrayal at the altar had shaken her to her core. She felt like a part of her had been broken, and she wasn't sure if she could ever put the pieces back together. But she was determined to try. She started by focusing on herself. She took up yoga, finding solace in the quiet moments of meditation and the gentle stretches that eased the tension in her body. She also began journaling, pouring her thoughts and emotions onto the pages of a notebook. It was cathartic, a way to process everything she had been through. Her friends and family were her rock during this time. They reminded her of her worth, of the love and strength she had always carried within her. "You're not defined by what happened," her best friend told her one evening. "You're defined by how you rise above it." Those words stayed with her, becoming a mantra she repeated to herself whenever doubt crept in. She started to rebuild her confidence, little by little. She took on new projects at work, throwing herself into her career with a renewed sense of purpose. She even started volunteering at a local shelter, finding joy in helping others and reminding herself of the good in the world. But healing wasn't linear. There were days when the pain felt fresh, when the memory of the slap and the humiliation would come rushing back, leaving her breathless. On those days, she allowed herself to grieve. She cried, she screamed into her pillow, and she leaned on her loved ones for support. She also began to reflect on her relationship with the groom. She thought about the love they had shared, the dreams they had built together, and the cracks that had started to form long before the wedding day. She realized that while his actions were inexcusable, their relationship hadn't been perfect. They had both made mistakes, and they had both ignored the warning signs. One day, she received a letter in the mail. She recognized his handwriting immediately, and her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure if she was ready to read it, but curiosity got the better of her. She sat down at her kitchen table, took a deep breath, and opened the envelope. The letter was heartfelt and raw. He didn't make excuses or ask for forgiveness. Instead, he apologized for the pain he had caused and shared the steps he had taken to change. He talked about his therapy, his efforts to set boundaries with his family, and the lessons he had learned about love and respect. "I don't expect anything from you," he wrote. "But I needed you to know that I'm sorry, and that I'll always be grateful for the love we shared. You made me a better person, and I'll carry that with me for the rest of my life." Tears streamed down her face as she read the words. She could feel the sincerity in every sentence, and it stirred something inside her. She wasn't ready to forgive him, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he was becoming the man she had always believed he could be. She didn't respond to the letter, but she kept it tucked away in a drawer, pulling it out occasionally to reread it. It became a reminder of how far they had both come, and how much they had both grown. As the months went by, she began to feel like herself again. She laughed more, smiled more, and started to dream about the future. She didn't know what that future held, but she knew one thing for sure: she was stronger than she had ever been. One evening, as she sat on her balcony watching the sunset, she realized something important. She had spent so much time focusing on what had gone wrong that she had forgotten to celebrate what had gone right. She had survived. She had healed. And she had come out the other side with a deeper understanding of herself and what she deserved. She wasn't sure if she would ever let him back into her life, but she knew that whatever decision she made, it would be on her terms. And that was enough. The bride had been healing, growing, and rediscovering herself for months. She had built a life that felt full and meaningful, even without him in it. But the letter he had sent lingered in her mind, a quiet reminder of the love they had once shared and the changes he claimed to have made. She wasn't sure if she was ready to open that door again, but she couldn't deny that a part of her was curious. One evening, as she sat with her best friend over a cup of tea, she finally voiced the thoughts she had been keeping to herself. "He sent me a letter," she said, her voice hesitant. "He's been going to therapy, working on himself. He apologized, not just to me, but to everyone he hurt." Her friend raised an eyebrow, setting her cup down. And? I don't know," the bride admitted. "Part of me wants to believe he's changed. But another part of me is scared. What if he hasn't? What if I let him back in and he hurts me again?" Her friend reached across the table, taking her hand. "Only you can answer that," she said gently. "But if you're even considering it, maybe it's worth having a conversation. Just to see where he's at." The bride nodded, her mind racing. She knew her friend was right. If she didn't at least talk to him, she would always wonder. A few days later, she called him. Her heart pounded as she dialed his number, but she forced herself to stay calm. When he answered, his voice was cautious, almost hesitant. "Hi," she said, her voice steady. "I got your letter. I think we should talk." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then he exhaled sharply, as if he had been holding his breath. "Of course," he said. "Whenever you're ready." They agreed to meet at a quiet cafe, a neutral space where they could talk without the weight of their past hanging over them. When the day arrived, she dressed simply, wanting to feel comfortable and confident. She arrived early, ordering a cup of tea and sitting at a corner table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When he walked in, her breath caught in her throat. He looked different, calmer, more grounded. There was a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there before, and he carried himself with a quiet confidence. He sat down across from her, his hands resting on the table. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, his voice sincere. She nodded, unsure of where to start. "I read your letter," she said finally. "And I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened. I need to know, are you really different? Or is this just another act?" He didn't flinch at the question. Instead, he leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers. "I'm different," he said. "But not because I'm trying to win you back. I'm different because I had to be. I had to face the person I was and decide who I wanted to be. And I know I can't undo what I did, but I'm committed to being better, for myself, and for anyone I'm lucky enough to have in my life." She studied his face, searching for any sign of insincerity. But all she saw was honesty and regret. "I'm not the same person I was," he continued. "And I don't expect you to just take my word for it. But if you're willing, I'd like the chance to show you. Not just through words, but through actions." She took a deep breath, her mind racing. She had spent so much time building walls around her heart, and the thought of letting him back in was terrifying. But she also couldn't ignore the connection they had once shared, or the changes she could see in him now. "I don't know if I can trust you again," she said honestly. "But I'm willing to try. Slowly. One step at a time." He nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. "That's all I ask," he said. They talked for hours, sharing stories about the past few months and the lessons they had learned. It wasn't easy, there were moments of tension, of pain, of doubt, but for the first time in a long time, they felt like a team. As they left the cafe, he turned to her, his expression serious. "Whatever happens, I want you to know that I'm grateful for this chance," he said. "And I'll do everything I can to prove that I'm worthy of it." She nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "We'll see," she said. And for the first time in months, she felt a flicker of hope. The journey to rebuild their relationship was slow and deliberate. The bride had made it clear that trust couldn't be rebuilt overnight, and the groom respected her boundaries completely. They started small, meeting for coffee or taking walks in the park, talking openly about their feelings and fears. It wasn't easy, there were moments of tension and doubt, but they were both committed to making it work. Over time, the bride began to see the changes in him. He was more patient, more thoughtful, and more willing to listen. He didn't shy away from difficult conversations, and he took responsibility for his actions without making excuses. She could tell he was trying, and that meant everything to her. One evening, as they sat together on a bench overlooking the city, he turned to her, his expression serious. "I know I can't undo the past," he said. "But I want you to know that I'm committed to being the person you deserve. And if you'll let me, I'd like to spend the rest of my life making it up to you." She looked at him, her heart swelling with emotion. She had come a long way since the day of the wedding, and so had he. They had both grown, both learned from their mistakes, and both realized how much they meant to each other. "I'm not saying it's going to be easy," she said, her voice steady. "But I'm willing to try. Because I believe in us." He smiled, his eyes filled with gratitude and love. "That's all I need," he said. A few months later, they decided to renew their vows in a small, intimate ceremony. This time, there was no pressure, no expectations, just the two of them, surrounded by the people who had supported them through everything. As she walked down the aisle, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. She looked at him, standing at the altar, and saw the man she had always believed he could be. When they exchanged their vows, there were no grand promises or flowery words, just a simple commitment to love and respect each other, no matter what. As they kissed, the guests erupted into applause, but all she could focus on was the feeling of his hand in hers and the knowledge that they had fought for this moment. The reception was filled with laughter and joy, a celebration of love, forgiveness, and second chances. As they danced together under the stars, she leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling a sense of contentment she hadn't felt in years. "I'm proud of us," she whispered. He smiled, pulling her closer. "Me too." Their journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. They had learned that love isn't just about the good times, it's about facing the hard times together and coming out stronger on the other side. As they looked out at their friends and family, they knew that their story wasn't just about a wedding gone wrong. It was about redemption, growth, and the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. And as they danced into the night, they knew that their new beginning was just the start of a lifetime of love and happiness. The end.